So the city is being bombarded. It's under siege. Women, hoop dresses, umbrellas, lace, going down the street, artillery raining down on them, and suddenly, there was an explosion in the street. And imagine that there's a horse that got killed in the explosion. Now, imagine that haughty-toddy woman with the big hoop dress and that, taking out a huge knife from her purse, going over to the horse and carving off her piece of meat to take home so that she had some food to eat. Sick. Nice. It's a strange, I mean, if you're picturing this, it doesn't quite match, does it? This fancy rich woman going up with a knife to a horse. But if you're starving, you will eat things that you don't think you'd normally eat. Horse is eaten around the world. In France, they eat horse. They have special butcher shops for just horse meat, just like they have special butcher shops for pork and beef. Central Asia, they actually get their milk from horses. And then eventually, when the horses are too old, then they'll kill the horses for the meat. Yeah. They're not going to kill each other and eat each other. We're not talking cannibalism. But horse was a means of transportation in this time, and so there were some horses in the city. So when a horse would die, you would actually see, especially when people got a lot hungrier, people swarming to the dead animal to carve it up to get their chunk of meat. They're not eating it raw, they will cook it, but they're actually just taking the meat so that they can take it home. Yeah. Dog is not eaten in most parts of the world. Dog can be, you can find some people in Korea eating dog. It's considered a delicacy and only for men. There are some places in China that will eat dog. If you go to a Chinese restaurant, you will not find dog on the menu. There is no dog or cat or pets anywhere in American restaurants. Now keep in mind, there are things that we eat that people won't touch in other parts of the world. For example, cow. We eat lots of beef in this country, but in India, they're considered sacred. They're holy. You do not eat them. They think we are as disgusting for eating cows as you think people are disgusting for eating cats and dogs and horses. It's all in what you're used to eating. It's a cultural thing. So, this is a little bit about the siege of Vicksburg. So, we already talked about that. Boom, 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 boom. Let's get to what we've already talked about a little bit because we got through some of these notes. We're dealing with the siege of Vicksburg, May through July. Now, what happens? The city is surrounded. It's put under siege. Siege means that it's surrounded. Nobody can get in or out. And they're trying to force the people to surrender. Here, Grant is not targeting soldiers. He is targeting civilians. Men, women, children, babies, old people, amputees in hospitals. They are the entire target. He says, we're not just going to target military people. We want to totally destroy the South and make the people surrender. Grant has a different view on this war. He bombed the city and he starved it out, trying to make life so miserable for those people that they give in. And they eventually do give in. And it's sort of symbolic what day they give in on. They surrendered on July 4th, 1863. This is the last hold the Confederacy had on the Mississippi River. So now the Union controls the Mississippi. Another part of which plan has now been accomplished. The first part, blockading southern ports, accomplished at the beginning of the war. The second part, controlling the Mississippi and dividing the Confederacy into two parts, has now been completed, and that is part of the Anaconda Plan. Good. Any questions on the siege of Vicksburg? People in the South today still remember how horrendous it was. Okay. What was the big battle where the 1st Minnesota helped out? Saved the day at one point? Lee gambled, and for one of the very few times in this war, Lee makes a mistake. That was Gettysburg. After the battle is done, because that battle happened when? When was Gettysburg? When was Gettysburg? July 1863. After the battle, because of the numbers of dead, they commemorated that area as a cemetery for the war dead. That's where they eventually put up the monument to the 1st Minnesota. And then Lincoln goes there to give a speech at the opening of the cemetery, the commemoration for people to remember those people that fell in that battle. The guy got up and spoke before Lincoln, and he went on for close to 2 hours. Lincoln got up and was done within 10 minutes. What is the name of his speech? What is the name of his speech? Yes. The Gettysburg Address. The Gettysburg Address. It happens November 1863. Gesundheit. Gesundheit again. The Gettysburg Address, November 1863. Lincoln goes to dedicate the cemetery to the fallen soldiers. He takes this time to reiterate what this war is about, keeping the Union together, and it's one of the most famous, or at least has one of the most famous starting lines in American history. Who thinks they can tell me the beginning of the Gettysburg Address? In years past, we've actually had people memorize it for extra credit, but I'm not doing that this year. Yes. 77 years ago, our forefathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation. Score? Anybody know what a score is other than what you get in a game? Yes. 20 years. Just like a dozen is 12, a score is 20. So 77 years ago would be a fancy way of saying what? What? 87 years ago, with the creation of the United States. 77 years ago, our forefathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation. Conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. We find ourselves now in the middle of a great civil war. I won't continue because I don't remember it all. But, Gettysburg Address. Main thing you need to know is that it commemorates the battle in the cemetery at Gettysburg, and that it's the 77 years ago one. Now, where has the U.S. had all of its victories with the exception of one location, and I'm not seeing my flags to put up there. Where has the U.S. had almost all of its victories except for one? All of its victories except for one have been in the West. And they've all been basically the result of this man. The drunk that was kicked out of the army in the 1850s and brought back to help fight this war. He has been the only general the U.S. has had that has been constantly winning. Who is that? Which general is that? That is General Grant. Now let's review our Eastern Union generals that we did a lot yesterday. On the count of three, give me the very first Union general, the guy that did not train the troops well, did not prepare well for the first Battle of Bull Run. On the count of three, 1, 2, 3. McDowell. Because he did not train his troops and it was a disaster at first Bull Run, he was replaced by McClellan. But McClellan had a case of the slows and he gave up 2 opportunities to end the war at Antietam. So he got booted out and replaced by Burnside. Burnside didn't want the job, and then he lost the battle and proved to Lincoln. He said, Lincoln, I told you, I didn't want it. I'm not good enough. He resigned, and he was replaced by, on the count of 3, 1, 2, 3, Hooker, Captain Hook. He then loses a battle, and then Lincoln replaces him with a guy called Meade. He was our 5th general for the Union. Meade does not capture or destroy Lee's army at Gettysburg, so Lincoln looks for somebody else to lead the U.S. Army. Meade is replaced. And Lincoln looks and says, who has constantly been winning? Grant. So Grant is now going to be head of the Union Army. Grant is the man. Grant, the man. He wins battles. He doesn't lose them. He doesn't miss opportunities. He kicks butt. So Lincoln puts him in charge. Grant is the Union's 6th general. The South, they've only needed one. And that was whom? Lee, yeah. So, because Grant has kicked butt in the West, and now the West is done, basically, we have the Mississippi, Lincoln puts him in charge of the army in the East. He actually puts him in charge of all the armies. Because he's the man. And Grant comes up with a brand new plan. A new way to win this war. No longer is it going to be, okay, let's try to take Richmond, blah, 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 blah. Oh, we just got our butt kicked by Lee. Okay, let's wait a little while. Okay, let's try again. That type of strategy is now done. He is going to try to take 2 armies and constantly hit the South. And if you lose, you don't wait several months. You turn around and you hit them again. And you hit them again. You basically pound them non-stop so that they have no chance of rebuilding their army after defeating your army every single time. Divide them and attack them non-stop. Beat their armies to a bloody pulp, and eventually they will lose. None of this, we don't want to hurt them because we want them to come back and they'll be our brethren again. No, it's beat them down, beat them to a bloody pulp, non-stop. Hammering away at them. Grant says, I'll take the Eastern armies. I will deal with fighting in the East. I will deal with hammering Virginia until there's no Confederate soldier left to fight back. He gives command to a different army, to a guy called what? William Tecumseh Sherman. Sherman. And his job is to go through and take the Deep South. Sherman takes the South, Grant takes the East. Both of them attack nonstop, hammering away at Confederate armies. You lose a battle, you don't wait too long before you attack again. You have more soldiers in the North than the South. So we'll just use up all of our soldiers. Yes. Grant is the general. He does not go out with the guns and fight. No. He sits in a tent and tells his lieutenants to tell his troops what to do. Okay? So Grant is the man. He actually wins. And so Lincoln figures he's the guy to put in charge. Heck, Lincoln's made 5 mistakes already. Why not try number 6? Now, remember, that new gun, they did not have a lot of them be put out into service. They couldn't make them fast enough. So not a lot of those guns actually made it out to the battlefield. Some did, but for the most part, about 90 to 95% of the soldiers out there did not have the new gun. If the war would have kept going on, more and more of those guns would have been able to get out there. So Grant is the man. But before we look at Grant, we're going to now look at Sherman. William Tecumseh Sherman. The war in the Deep South. We have already divided the Confederacy into 2 with the Mississippi River. The next plan is for Sherman to take his troops and divide the South yet again. So we've already divided the South once. The North is looking at dividing it yet again. Gets down to a city in Georgia. A big city in Georgia. A big city in Georgia where CNN is headquartered in, so is Coca-Cola. And Delta is there. And it's heavily fortified, and that city is Atlanta. We're looking at Atlanta. Sherman goes down to Atlanta and lays siege to the city. Atlanta is a major southern city. So far it has been away from the fighting, but now Sherman has brought the fighting to Atlanta. This is a battle/siege again. July through September. Surround the city. Hammer it. Starve them out. Make them beg for surrender. We're not being Mr. Nice Guy anymore from the North. General Sherman is the guy. His name eventually becomes used as a name of a tank. The Sherman tank, which was developed long after this war. There were no tanks in this war. The very first tanks were in World War I. What's he trying to do? Split the Deep South. Trying to drive yet another wedge here. Just like controlling the Mississippi. That's the goal. He gets to Atlanta, and he takes Atlanta in September 1864. Then he starts one of the most notorious, meaning for Southerners, one of the nastiest parts of this war. It's called Sherman's March to the Sea. Sherman was not going to play around anymore. The first 5 Eastern generals had accomplished virtually nothing in his eyes. He and Grant agreed to hammer the South nonstop. No prisoners, so to speak. What he does is, after taking Atlanta, he focuses on a town on the coast, a town called Savannah. Savannah, Georgia is his goal. It's on the coast. It will finish dividing up the South yet again. His plan and his orders, as his troops are marching from Atlanta to Savannah, is to destroy everything in its path. Burn all the fields, all the buildings, rip up and destroy all the railroad tracks, all the communication lines, kill all the farm animals, so that the people and the army there have no food, have no way of attacking them, no transportation, and that they will surrender. He leaves a 50-mile wide path of destruction from Atlanta all the way down to Savannah. Rip up the railroads, burn farms, burn plantations. Atlanta's up here, Savannah's down here. It is a 50-mile wide path of destruction. You leave absolutely, positively nothing that either the Southern Army could use or that the civilians could use against you. Grant did this in Vicksburg with the siege. Sherman did this in Atlanta. No longer is your target or your enemy only the army. Now your enemies are civilians as well, because you cannot trust the civilians once you leave the area. So you target them as well. Civilians are enemies in wartime. Don't just attack armies on the battlefield, attack their families in the cities. Lower their morale. If you attack their families in the cities, are those Southern soldiers going to stay in the army? Where might they go? Home to protect their families. So you target their families. Hey, we targeted, in the United States, we targeted civilians back then. We targeted civilians in World War II. We bombed entire cities where there were no soldiers. The city of Dresden, I showed you pictures of how black it was. They firebombed it where the people had no oxygen in the city to breathe. They died from lack of oxygen. Today we say, oh, you cannot attack civilians. That's bad. That's evil. We've done it for over 100 years. This idea of destroying everything that's useful, civilians as enemies, this has a name. This is called total war. It is not a limited war. This is total war. Everybody is your enemy. Everything is a target. Destroy everything useful. Sherman's march to the sea. Southerners still remember it today, and they are still ticked off about it today. 150 some years later, they're still, they still remember. Any questions about Sherman's march? Okay. Let's take a look at Grant, because we've got Sherman's done. Let's take a look at Grant. Let's see him finish this off. We're going to look at how Grant just hammers Lee in Virginia. Wham! Ooh, I lost. I'm going to come back the next day. Wham! Ooh, I lost. I'm going to come back the next day. Boom! You just hammer away. He eventually lays siege to a town called Petersburg. And the way Petersburg is located, here's Petersburg, just showing you in relation. Here's Petersburg, here's Richmond. Between Richmond and Petersburg is a rail line. All supplies that would go to Richmond, the capital, had to first go through Petersburg. So by cutting off and laying siege to Petersburg, Grant has also cut off whom? Or where? By laying siege to Petersburg, Grant has also cut off Richmond. That's the reason. He's also, as a result, cut off Richmond. He cut off Richmond. I don't want that picture there. I forgot the eraser's actually working. So, he cuts off Richmond. That's the whole point of surrounding Petersburg. And so he hammers Petersburg, cuts it off. No supplies. The siege of Petersburg, June 64 to April 65. Wow is right. June to July, August, September, October, November, December, January, February, March, April. 10 months. No food in. 10 months. No way in, no way out. Now they do have a way out to a certain degree. They can get out through the back side of the city. Eventually, though, after 10 months of being cut off, the people eventually surrender. Lee actually takes his army away from Petersburg to keep his army alive, but Petersburg falls, and shortly after Petersburg falls, what else is going to fall? Richmond falls. Petersburg falls, and Richmond falls quickly afterwards. The last part of what has just happened? The last part of what has just happened? Doug? The Anaconda Plan. The Anaconda Plan is now done. Blockade of southern ports. Check. Control of the Mississippi. Check. Capture Richmond. Check. Now it's just a matter of time. There is very little resistance left. Eventually, the entire war comes to this building right here. This is a house in a town that sounds like it's the building name, but it's not the building name. It's the name of the town where the war ends. Anybody know the name of the town where Lee surrenders to Grant? Nobody remembers the name. That's not good. Lee realizes that there's no way to win. And even though his soldiers don't want him to, Lee arranges to surrender and end this war. His soldiers tell him, and they're crying, "Don't surrender, let's keep fighting." And Lee realizes that fighting will only cause more deaths to the Southerners, and it would not accomplish anything. So, in a house, in a town called Appomattox Courthouse, the town's name is Appomattox Courthouse, Lee surrenders. Lee surrenders in the town called Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th, 1865. Grant, who has been hammering Lee this entire time, realizes what a genius Lee is. Grant tells Lee that he accepts his surrender and that he will let all Lee's soldiers go. Not arrest them, not put them in a prison camp, but let them go as long as they turn in their guns, and that Grant will give them food and supplies so that they can make it back to their families. Grant, along with Sherman, fought this concept of total war. But Grant also knew that now that the war was done, the country was and had to live together. This war divided families. When I divided this classroom, we had Southerners and we had Northerners. Some of you Southerners had relatives that lived in the North. Some of you Northerners had relatives that lived in the South. Some of you in North and South, as you were fighting your relatives on the battlefield. Some of you didn't even realize it. Some of you actually killed your own relatives without realizing it. This war has often been described as being brother against brother. Rarely did that happen, even though it would happen occasionally, but often cousin against cousin. During this war, you did not get together with your family from the North or the South, depending on what side you were on, for the holiday. This country, with this war being over, had to rebuild and had to make those connections again. To this day, the forest regions of this country tend to be in the South, partially due to the devastation that happened in this war. And there are still people in the South that hate the North. You've seen it on Family Guy, you've seen it on various episodes, making fun of people in the South that say, well, the South won. The South didn't win, but many people in the South are still proud of the fight they put up. And if you looked at all those battles that we've talked about so far, and how the Southern Army, undersupplied, underfed, outnumbered, constantly kicked the Northern Army's butt, in that regard, do you think they have something to be proud of? Not the idea of slavery, but that they stood up for what they believed in, because that wasn't what they were fighting for, it was states' rights. But now that we've been fighting for so long, on the back wall, 1861 to 1865, it's going to be hard to put this country back together again. But the good thing is, the war is over. The war is over. Now it's time for the healing to begin.